Hello, everyone. This is Jason York from the University of Business, and I want to welcome everyone to today's web seminar, Student Engagement in Online Learning, What Works and Why, brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, D2L. Please review these quick housekeeping items on your screen before we get underway, including the answer to our most frequently asked question. Yes, everyone who registered or attended will receive a link to the slides and a recording from today's webinar. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Christopher Sessions, Director of Academic Affairs at D2L, and Dr. Darcy White, Instructional Designer at D2L.
Thank you,
Take
Jason.
it away, Darcy and Chris. Great to have you with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jason. Thank you so much. Hello, I'm Chris Sessions. I'm Director of Academic Affairs at D2L, and I am joined by Darcy White, my most favorite instructional designer at D2L. And we are here today to talk about student engagement in online learning, what works and why. Now, this is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, and we look forward to unpacking it with you over the next hour. But before we get started, here's how today's session will work. We'll jump directly into our topic at hand in just a moment and break every 5 to 7 minutes for 2 to 3 questions from participants. Now, don't be shy. This is an opportunity to ask us anything about student engagement online. Between us, Darcy and I have been focusing on supporting online teaching and learning for many, many years, and we try to approach course design with a beginner's mind so that we don't assume too much and stay curious. So no question is too silly or too out of bounds. So let's jump right in. Recently, Darcy and I put on a web seminar focusing on getting started online, which you can access anytime at the URL provided. And I put it in the chat as well. Our goal in that session was to unpack key concepts and steps one should consider when transitioning a face-to-face course online. So today, we wanted to start with a few key takeaways from that session to set the stage for our discussion today. So Darcy, what did we learn from our last session?
Thanks, Chris. So just to get started with what we learned last time, like Chris said, this was a session about getting started online. So the first thing we talked about is the importance of planning ahead. And when we're talking about planning ahead, what we mean here is starting to plan the loose structure of the course you're going to be putting online, things like what the learning outcomes are going to be for each of the modules, what the key topics will be, as well as when you're going to actively engage with your students. We also talked about the fact that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And what we meant by that is, you already have all this great content you've curated for a face-to-face version of the course potentially. You don't need to take all of that and throw it out the window. You can use that as the basis of what you're doing in the online version of the course, and then spend the extra time you have because of that thinking about ways to make it more interactive. We also talked about the importance of presence. So this is engaging actively with your learners to really build that connection and motivate them throughout a course. This ties into the next point here, so regular touch points. It's really important to check in regularly with your students and offer them support in the online environment. This can do a lot to reduce the feelings of isolation that can sometimes come along with online learning in instances where students aren't really communicating with others. So you really want to make sure that you're trying to address that. We also talked about the importance of feedback. And what we meant here wasn't feedback you're giving to learners, though that is, of course, important as well. What we talked about was actually gathering feedback throughout the course from your learners to see what's working well, what isn't, and then using that feedback to go in and make improvements or changes to the course. And this ties into the final point here, which is taking an iterative approach to building courses. So you don't have to get everything right the first time around. You can put everything online, have a starting point, and then come back to it and make improvements for each of the course offerings. Now I'll pass it over to Chris, who's going to get into what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Darcy. So today we want to focus specifically on the importance of engaging learners online. And so what do we mean when we talk about engagement in an online learning environment? Well, student engagement can be defined as the strategies and tactics that lead to greater student involvement, greater knowledge acquisition, and general cognitive development. The National Survey on Student Engagement and the associated efforts by the Community College Survey on Student Engagement define engagement as the frequency with which students participate in activities that represent effective educational practices, and conceive of it as a pattern of involvement in a variety of activities and interactions, both in and out of the classroom and throughout a student's college career. It's also worth noting that student engagement has two key components: time and effort, and institutional support. The first is the amount of time and effort students put into their studies and other activities that lead to the experiences and outcomes that constitute student success. The second is the way institutions allocate resources and organize learning opportunities and services to induce students to participate in and benefit from such activities. Another way to frame engagement is through the use of active learning and active learning strategies, which we will focus on today. So Darcy, why active learning?
Going back to the time and effort component of engagement that Chris just talked about, a key factor in getting students to put time and effort into their studies is tapping into curiosity and interest to boost motivation and attention. And this is particularly important in the online environment where learners are often taking part in self-directed learning. And they're the ones who are driving how and when they learn. And this is where active learning comes in. Really what we mean here is that students need to be involved. By making students active participants in their own learning, for example, through getting them to work on problems or think critically about the content instead of passively taking it in, you can help them make connections and apply what they've learned. Active involvement also has the added benefit of making the learning more impactful as well. Giving learners applied ways of learning really enhances recollection and learning outcomes as a result. If we're thinking of what ways we can promote active learning and engaging learning in an online class, there are a few things to consider on this slide here. But before getting into that, it's important to highlight the interactions that students will have in the online environment. The first is learner to instructor. This is any type of interaction that a student has with the person teaching or facilitating the course. The next is learner to peers. Any interactions the learner has with others in the course, so things like discussions, group work. And learner to content. This could be the learner interacting with the content the first time they're working through the course, when they're reviewing the content, and when they're engaging with activities and assessments. So you really want to tap into all three of these interactions to promote that active and engaging learning. So how can we do that? The first point here, building an online community. And this is something that Chris is going to talk about a bit more in a moment. Next, encouraging interest and creativity. We kind of touched on this already. This increases motivation as a result. Also, creating opportunities for students to drive their learning. So giving students agency. What we mean by this is giving students some choice over their learning to get them more involved and motivated. For example, letting them participate in brainstorming course objectives or allowing them to choose between a couple of topics to explore in an assignment. We also want to think about using multiple tools and content presentation formats. Now, this is something we talked about in more detail in the last session we did, so we won't be spending as much time on it today. But what we mean here is to take advantage of the mixed media approach that's available to you in the online space to really draw learners in and help them stay attentive in the course.
So I want to dig a little deeper into the learning communities idea for a minute. It's one of my favorite concepts in teaching and learning because a learning community right away suggests a clear purpose, learning. It then combines with that purpose with a community or a group of people working together with shared interests, a shared goal, responsibilities toward one another, and to the group as a whole. So a learning community is a place where students can feel a sense of belonging, where people can feel comfortable seeking help, and where people feel respected and valued. So if we logic this out, to create opportunities for engagement and connection, collaborative work is really key. And online, there are many tools you can use to support a learning community, increase collaboration, and promote active learning. So let's take a look at some of before we do, I just want to check and see if there's any questions from our audience regarding what we've covered so far. And I notice we do have quite a few questions already in the Q&A. So the first question comes from Kate, who asks, how do we allow students to produce authentic interactive speech in an asynchronous environment? Oh, that's a good question, Kate.
That is a very good question. Yeah, so you could think of a few different ways of doing this. I know there are some tools out there. I know in our world with Brightspace, there's Bongo, which allows for some question and answer type assignments as well as presenting through video or working with peers through video. So that's one way of doing it. You could also think of holding, even though it's an asynchronous course, some synchronous sessions where you meet with learners and they talk through something with you. I know that might be a bit difficult to book, so you could also think of just getting them to record something and submit that as an assignment. I don't know, Chris, if you also had any suggestions from your experience.
Well, interactive speech, it's a really good, I like that. The challenge, though, is sometimes I'm going to say, kind of an equity issue. Depending on what kinds of software students have, hopefully everybody has the basics that they can get online and are able to share video and share audio. But it's a really good idea to think about how to use that speech. Particularly, I found we'll get into this in a little bit around discussion forums. I've had students post discussion responses using audio and video as opposed to just typing out using text. And I found that really increased the amount of engagement that I saw in my students because they were kind of curious to hear what each other sounded like, as well as with video, they wanted to see what each other looked like as well. And this was pre-COVID, so we weren't all zoomed out. So it did provide a very unique experience when I first started playing with that. But I've got another question here that I want to follow up on. And this is from Jason Albertson. And Jason asks, my experience with online learners is that most resist group work and aren't looking for a sense of belonging. How do you address that reluctance?
That is another great question. I know from my experience that a lot of learners have issues with group work because sometimes it feels a bit forced. And I'm sure that's feedback we've all heard when dealing with students going through group projects. But I found that a good way of getting them really motivated is introducing everyone up front in a course, really getting everyone comfortable with one another. I know some students might not want that sense of belonging you're saying, but at least getting them more comfortable with the idea of collaborating with their classmates, communicating with their classmates. And then when it comes to actually getting involved with group work, something that I always found helpful back when I was at the University of Waterloo is having some contracts up front, group contracts of how group members are expected to interact with one another, how much they're expected to contribute, and then also considering coming up with kind of shared goal assignments. So outlining a few different topics and actually having students sign up for which one they're most interested in. Then they're really motivated to complete an assignment around that topic. It gets them more involved, and that can really help with the group work piece as well. And then one more thing before I pass it over to Chris in case he has anything else to add. I found that peer feedback can be really helpful too, because then group members are kind of holding each other accountable, right? As an instructor, you can't typically see what's actually happening within that group. You only see the final output, the project, whatever they're submitting. So if you get peer feedback included as a component of that, then you can get more insight into what the group dynamics were, how much everyone was collaborating and participating with one another.
Those are really good points, Darcy. I found that working with groups, and you're right, most students, I feel like resist group work in many ways. One of the ways I got around that was, as Darcy mentioned, providing choice in terms of group assignments, so students could pick the group activity that they felt most comfortable in. The other thing that I found, two other things I found is having really clear roles within the group, so that students know exactly what's expected of them. really went a long way. So they weren't guessing, what am I supposed to be doing? And other people aren't doing their job. And you get into those debates, which can be really ugly. The other thing I just want to just plant a seed about is this idea of, sometimes we learn the most when we're uncomfortable, right? When we're put in that sense of disequilibrium, and we're trying to find that balance. We're trying to find that middle ground. And in that is really where the learning really takes place. And while students may resist, as they do in many cases around group work, they really are able to actually go a little deeper within the content and actually produce better work. I think there's some good research. I know Harvard did a study on that last year, showing that while students really resisted active groups in their classes, the work they produced was much better, and they scored much better on exams through that forced group work. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure. Well, we do have some more questions, but I'm going to have to pause it right there, but we will come back to them because I want to keep us moving along and we can keep things on time. So I apologize if we haven't gotten to your question just yet, but we will be circling back again shortly. So Darcy, let's talk about tools you can use to increase collaboration and promote active learning.
We're going to start with announcements. Before talking about this type of tool in more detail, I wanted to point out the screenshot on the slide. For each of the tools we're talking about, we're going to have screenshots from the environment we're most familiar with, so Brightspace, as an example of what these tools look like in the online environment for those of you who aren't as familiar with the learning management system. If you do use a different system, they may look different than what you're used to, and then the names might be a bit different as well. So back to announcements, which live on the course homepage. As you can see in the example on the slide here, one thing you can use announcements for is welcoming students to the course. This is a good way to kick things off and start building a connection with them from the outset of a course. The tool is also designed to allow instructors to provide students with updates, reminders, and other important information throughout a course. This is great for increasing active learning and engagement because it builds a connection with students, it offers them support, and it helps them keep up to date with important course information. This creates a sense of community and a connection with you as the instructor right off the bat, which then can increase motivation and persistence in a course as a result. There's a lot of evidence showing that when you show up for students, it really makes them want to show up for you in the course as well. You can also draw on other tools like what we call release conditions in Brightspace. So this can make the messages more personalized and impactful because you're releasing announcements based on something a student has done or hasn't done within a course. And you can also use tools like, we call these replace strings, so things that pull information from the learning management system like the student's name. So you can see in the example here, this announcement actually says, "Hi, Darcy." So that makes the experience more personalized as well. It feels more like a conversation with you as the instructor. Next, activity feed. This tool would also live on the home page, but it differs from announcements in that it allows everyone to communicate with one another. So it's really generating that instructor to learner interaction, just like announcements, but also that learner to learner interaction. And it uses a format that's familiar to students who are accustomed to communicating using things like social media. So this tool can be used to increase active learning and engagement by allowing students to share ideas and resources, communicate with others, provide one another with support, and build that sense of community right from the homepage. And our last tool before taking another quick break for questions is discussions. So discussions are typically used for instructor to learner and learner to learner communication, social learning, and providing support. Discussions can be used to increase active learning and engagement by giving students the opportunity to learn through sharing ideas, hearing others' opinions, critically evaluating posts, and receiving peer feedback. There's also room here to give students instructor support through approaches like using an Ask the Instructor discussion where students can post questions they have and all students can see a response. This increases your presence and connection with students and reduces your workload since you aren't answering the same question multiple times through email. If you are using an Ask the Instructor discussion, I would caution you to warn students that the posts they make are visible to the class. So if it's more of a personal question, then they should still reach out through email or some other private means of communication. This goes back to a question we had earlier about group work. I know that discussions can sometimes be hit or miss for students. One of the main complaints I've heard is that they can feel forced. So it's going back to that feeling of authenticity in the discussions as well. To address this concern and encourage active participation, consider inviting students to introduce themselves at the beginning of the course to get everyone comfortable participating. So I know we touched on this a bit already, but you can consider going beyond the basic, hi, my name is X, I'm an optometry student, especially in cases where it's a single cohort moving through a program who might already know one another. So for example, you can ask students to answer a question like, what is one unique talent, hobby, or interest you have, and what do you like about it in their introductory post? Similar to what we mentioned as well for group work, you can consider providing a set of ground rules about discussion etiquette that will help keep the conversation active and civil. For example, you could remind students that they may have different opinions from their peers, and that's okay. The key is to focus on what they disagree with and why, so debating the issue rather than on the person who's posted. You can also use settings that promote participation like groups. So if you're dividing a larger class into smaller groups, you'll have more active participation than if you have a single discussion thread with 500 or so students. You can think about making students post first before they see their peers' posts. A benefit of that is that they're not biased in what they're posting, encouraging more active debate. And maybe giving them some choice in discussion topics. So maybe they have a couple of options of what they can speak to. One other thing to note about discussions before moving on is that they can be used for things other than just communicating and discussing content. So for example, to really promote that active learning, you could get students to sign up for a topic and they would own that topic and actually teach their peers in a discussion thread, and then their peers would ask them questions within the discussion. So it's more of a teach and ask questions rather than just communication between peers.
You know, real quickly, Darcy, on discussion boards, I find that that's one of those topics that people have a love-hate relationship with. Either they really like discussion boards and use them well, or they really can't stand them because they've seen them turn into absolute train wrecks. I've experienced both. So I want to sort of circle back to your idea of ground rules as well. I found that when I was able to create ground rules for my students to say, this is what's expected of you. And I always have to remember, I need to model that as well. So any kind of ground rules that we came up with were real important that we stuck to them or addressed them. And another interesting point about that is creating those ground rules together provides another avenue for encouraging engagement and active participation by students. So this gives students a chance to have some say in what that discussion forum will look like. I've also made the mistake of using my discussion forum for a place to post, I'm going to say it, short essays. and then I find myself grading essays in a discussion forum rather than separately in an assignment. And that just created all kinds of chaos. Pretty much, if you could do it the wrong way, that's how I've started. It's just really doing it the hard way. So hopefully some of this advice resonates with folks here on the line. And with that, let's take a look at some more questions here from our audience, and we are starting to get quite a few more. So again, I apologize if I don't get to all of them. We will do our best, but I have one here from Jason Tang Simmons, if I said that right. He says, I teach college cross-section anatomy course. It is a fairly dry course. It is mainly about rote memorization and location. It doesn't particularly allow for problem solving. Do you have any suggestions for moving these kinds of classes online?
Yes, so even for those topics that may not lend themselves as well to traditional problem solving, you can still make the experience more interactive. And I know this is something we talked about more in our last session by taking advantage of the fact that online you can really take that mixed media approach. So it can be a text-based course that also includes video, images, infographics, a variety of formats to get learners to engage with the content. Something we're going to talk about in a little bit, but I'll touch on now, is just practice activities and opportunities for self-assessment in the content. So you can think of ways to make it a bit more interactive rather than just that rote memorization, right? Getting learners to go in, maybe do some practice questions and see how they're doing and reflect on that. There's also, for anatomy, I know there are a lot of good resources available that I think are mostly free that you can look into for more of an immersive experience where it's similar to augmented reality, where they can actually move around a model and look at different pieces of it and get more information about it. So that's another way that you can make that a bit more interactive than just reading through content.
Well, that sounds good, Darcy. There's a couple more questions I want to try and get to. One of them is asking us about accommodations and folks with learning disabilities. And a little later, we're going to speak to that, but kind of indirectly. So I'll save that one for a little later. Another question comes in from Ken Mellendorf, who asks, what are the differences between always the same group and rearranging groups from time to time?
That is a great question. So a benefit of using the same groups throughout a course is that the students really get familiar with one another. They get comfortable discussing more openly or getting engaged with communication with those peers. But there's also value in mixing up groups because, when you're in a group, you are sharing your individual perspectives. Students come from a variety of different backgrounds, and you get some different insights on the content. But if you're only working with the same group, you're still then somewhat more limited. So if you mix the groups up a bit, then students can be exposed to other points of view as well. But something else you can do is you could still stick with those same smaller groups throughout to keep that level of comfort going. And then as the instructor, you can summarize what the various groups have talked about in a discussion or ask if groups are willing to share group projects with the rest of the class to give their peers a feel for what's come up in those other groups.
Well, that makes sense. And Darcy, I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll jump back in. And I promise we will circle back and have more time for questions here. So William Duffy asks, how do you avoid the herding of opinions, herding, H-E-R-D-I-N-G, of opinions in discussion boards? They so often become a sea of agreement. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. So one of the points I mentioned before was that must post first discussion setup, where you actually get students to post their perspective on something before they even see their peers' responses. So that's one way of mitigating that a little bit. You can also explore things like anonymous posting. If peers are worried about being the one person who's standing out and disagreeing with the group, you can try anonymous posting. And really that discussion etiquette or upfront reminder that it's okay to have differences of opinion can really help with that too.
Indeed, indeed. And thank you for those questions. And I promise we will return to those as time permits, but I think we should have plenty of time to look at those some more. So let's hop back into our examination of tools that can be used to further support a learning community, active learning, and student engagement. So Darcy, what's next?
Next is assignments. So assignments are usually designed for project-based work that's either individual or collaborative. And they can be used to increase active learning and engagement by giving students the opportunity to engage with scenarios, case studies, and problems that require higher order skills like analysis, application, problem solving, reflection, and more. So any of those higher order skills. Assignments can also be used to get students to report on experiential or applied learning experiences. So for example, you can ask students who are participating in a co-op or internship opportunity to summarize and reflect on a hands-on experience they had. Some key things to keep in mind when you are creating any assessment or activity or assignment is to make it clear to students what's expected of them and what they're getting out of completing this assignment. This really helps to push the point home of what the benefit is for the student, really helping to increase that motivation to engage with the assignment. And it's also important to think of, for any of the things we're talking about today, the importance of providing students with some personalized feedback that can help them develop their skills. So if they're actively participating or actively engaging in their learning, it's really valuable to them to get that feedback from you as the instructor that tells them how they're doing and what they might need to work on. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, assignments can be collaborative. And this really ties back into that community building piece by getting students to work together, learn from one another, and provide each other with support. It also gives them the opportunity to learn actively through collaboration with others. So for example, you could include a peer feedback component, like was mentioned earlier, and this can really help them work on some of those soft skills, communication skills, and also things like evaluation, collaboration. Next are portfolios. So portfolios are designed for collecting evidence of learning, reflecting on learning, and sharing with peers. With a portfolio, students are actively driving which evidence they include and share, so it's really learner-directed, giving them that sense of agency and choice. And they're also able to self-assess and reflect on their progress. Peer and instructor feedback can also be used here to illuminate areas for improvement and provide students with experience critically evaluating others' work again. It can also contribute to community building as a result of that peer interaction through the portfolio. Portfolios also make it easier for students to share things in the real world. What I mean by that is if a student comes across something that relates to their course content, they can easily snap a picture and add that to their portfolio and then reflect on how it relates. This gets them thinking about connections and content both inside and outside of the virtual classroom. And it's really a great way of allowing students to gather evidence of learning and samples of work they've completed and take it with them as a package of what they've done in a course or across courses. Next up is self-assessments. Self-assessments, we touched on a little bit already with that one question earlier. They're any practice activity or quick check-in that make a course more interactive and allow students to check in and self-assess their learning. They're a great way of increasing active learning and engagement for a few reasons. For one, they help break up the content, re-engaging attention and giving students a break from just passively taking that content in. They also allow students to check in on their progress, actively participate in the online environment, and again, reflect on their learning. You'll notice we're mentioning reflection a lot today. That's a really important piece of that too, is really reflecting on their learning. This gives students a read on where they're doing well and what topics they might need to review. Not only does this approach really enhance recall, but the benefit is even greater in those instances where students are able to make mistakes and learn from them. So if I hit a self-assessment in a course as a student and I'm not doing so well on it, that's going to stick with me. I'm going to go back and revisit the content that's related to that question or activity, and I'll remember having made that mistake and then gone and checked into it. So that's another benefit of the self-assessments too, really that room for making errors and working off of that. And there are also some other tools that can be used to increase active engagement, but will require an entire session of their own to be talked about in depth. But we'll list them here for you anyway and just touch on them briefly. The first is rubrics. These are great for setting expectations for students before they complete an assessment, so giving them an idea of what you're looking for them to achieve a specific level. And then they can also use rubrics after they've completed an assessment to self-assess and reflect on how they did. Next on the list here is what we call intelligent agents. So these can really personalize the experience for a student going through an online course. It's a message that's sent out to a student based on something that's happened in the environment. So maybe they've gotten halfway through a course, so they've hit the halfway point in the course content. You send them an email congratulating them and encouraging them to continue. Or it can be performance-based, like the example that's on the slide here. So maybe you have one that goes out when a student doesn't meet a specific threshold in an assessment, encouraging them to go back in, review some specific content. So it can be remedial in that way too. And the last example here are awards or badges. Again, these can be used to personalize the experience a bit because they're based on things that the learner is doing in the environment. And they can also be used to really gamify the experience and to motivate students going through an online course.
So one area we've left out of discussion today is the notion of accessibility and engaging all learners. Now, this is clearly a deep and important topic, which we knew we would need to spend much more time on. And to this end, D2L is offering a web seminar later this week, actually on Thursday, focusing specifically on accessibility for every learner. If you're interested, you can sign up at this link, which I've pushed into the chat. So we hope to see you there. It's one of my favorite topics, actually. So Darcy, as we sort of bring our formal presentation to a close and we're about to open up the door to some more questions, before we do, though, if I were to say, what are some key takeaways that we want participants to leave with, what might you say?
So the first thing would be that learner engagement is crucial for increasing motivation and learning outcomes. As we mentioned in the beginning of the session, this is especially true in the online space where learners are often choosing how and when to engage with the content. Next is that building a learning community piece. So this sets the stage for success by creating a sense of belonging, by giving students a support network, and really promoting that social learning, so learning from one another. And something else we touched on related to this is that making students feel like part of a community working towards a shared goal and showing them this support can make a world of difference in how motivated they are to engage with the content. And then finally, we talked a lot about tools. There are a lot of tools available to you that you can use online in your courses to boost engagement and build in those active learning opportunities. So we really encourage you to take advantage of the range of options that are available to you online.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Darcy. Now, finally, I would like to add that at D2L, we believe that learning is the foundation upon which all progress and achievement rests. We are always here to talk about how the learning platform can help you reach your institution's unique teaching and learning needs. And if you have any questions or want to connect with a product expert, please reach out to us at highered@d2l.com. So with that, I think it's time for us to take a look at some questions, and we got quite a few, and I'm hoping we can get through a good chunk of them. We've set aside plenty of time for this, and if we are unable to answer your questions, we will be getting those offline, and we will be addressing them via email as well. So we can follow up with you there as well. So fear not, we'll get to you. Some really interesting questions in here, Darcy, as I've been looking at the Q&A. There's so many angles and so many ways, places to begin, but I'm just going to look at Neha Prakash asks, how can we use discussions for math courses? Have you ever worked with a math course and had discussion?
That is a great question. You can still use discussions in some of those STEM or math courses as well, both to build community, give learners an opportunity to maybe ask each other questions about problems and chat through them to get that support they need. But you could also think about problem solving and talking through how they came to a solution to a particular problem through the discussion. And the other example that I gave earlier too is that teach and ask questions. So maybe a student is responsible for a topic in a given week, they teach their peers about it and their peers ask them questions. So you're still getting that active engagement going, even though it might not be your typical discussion post.
You know, I think about that and I'm triggered by the idea of metacognition, specifically thinking out loud about my thinking. And a discussion forum could be a really good place for me as an instructor to go. So when I look at a problem like X, this is how I begin to sort of unpack it. And I know that we're all experts as instructors and we have subject matter expertise, but sometimes it's important to remember this is the first time many students are seeing this content. So it's real important to kind of take kind of smaller steps to think about the fact that if you were explaining this to someone who had never seen it before, and that might be a way to also sort of think about using a discussion forum to help sort of provide more insight in how you think about problems. You know, give students some more examples. That's a very good question. I have another question here. We do have quite a few on discussion boards. I'll do a couple more and then I'll skip down. The most, this is from Paul Bohan Broderick. I hope I said that right. The most successful discussion boards for my classes are the ones in which I've been most active. And a good discussion community seems to involve a lot of work. Any advice on limiting instructor time on the discussion board?
Yeah, so that can definitely be the case, especially if you have a large class. So something I typically recommend, I know we talked about having a plan a bit more in the last session, but it really is having that plan for what your minimum level of interactivity will be on that discussion board. So having a goal of how many students you want to respond to in a given week. So that can show your presence in that way. Also, that Ask the Instructor board, if that's open to the entire course, then students can see that you're active on there, that you're checking in. But you don't have to do as much checking in because it is that one forum where you're answering questions. Another thing, which again is maybe a little bit of work, but for some of those discussions that, I guess imagine you have a minimum response threshold of, I want to answer 3 students in a week. Maybe there's some discussions you're not hitting then if you're dividing the class into smaller groups. So what you can do in those cases is post a summary of the points that came up using a tool like announcements to show that you've still been monitoring that discussion, even if you're not going in and actively participating or actively responding to everyone in there. So those are a few ways of doing it. Just really showing that you're active or present in the course as a whole can be really helpful for still encouraging that communication.
All right. Well, I've got another question for you. This is from Carla Leibold. Do you think it's wise or ethical to post things under discussion that are graded as if they were a right or wrong answer? For example, as if it were a quiz. It seems misleading to me, but I've seen it done. Any thoughts about that?
So this is where, if you're having a discussion that's more of an opinion that a student is backing up or critically thinking about a topic, and you don't want to grade them as right or wrong, this is where you can think of instead grading how they've presented that point. So have they backed it up with evidence? Have they actively interacted with their peers in the board? So you can do it that way instead, where you're not actually grading their response itself for its rightness or wrongness, but you're grading their ability to back up their point, to think critically about other posts. So targeting more of those higher level skills, or maybe some of those active participation goals if you want to make sure they're actually in there responding to peers. So you can grade it in a way that's not saying that their answer is necessarily wrong, but giving them feedback on how they're presenting their points.
Ooh, that's interesting. And I have on a similar line here, a question from Pat Watson. And Pat asks, how do you get students to ask good critical thinking questions?
This is another case where I think this is something Chris may have mentioned earlier, where you as the facilitator or instructor kind of modeling that behavior is really helpful, or asking students who have done a particularly good job of this in the past of whether you can use their post as an exemplar or a sample without their name attached to it, just to give students an idea of what the best case ideal post would look like. So really modeling that behavior for them and coaching them through that process.
Yes, indeed. I believe that in a course, I as an instructor am the chief learner, and I'm really there to model learning because that's really what I do as a subject matter expert. I'm always learning. And I'm reminded of one of my mentors used to tell me, if you're doing more work in your class than your students, who's learning more? And I'm like, oh, good point. But you know that beats up against my wall of perfectionism, which I'm always trying to pull down a little bit. I've got another question for you from J. Michael Leger, and J. Michael asks, are you supportive of allowing students to choose type of assignments to demonstrate meeting a course objectives?
I would say absolutely. if you have some course objectives that the mode in which a student demonstrates a skill or their knowledge of a topic is flexible, then giving them some choice in how they show that they've learned that, how they express their understanding, I think is very valuable. That can be really motivating to them to know that they have that agency, that choice over how they're demonstrating learning. And it can also be helpful for maybe some students don't like expressing themselves in writing as much as they like talking through something. So you're giving them the ability to show their understanding or the skills they've achieved or earned through going through this course in a way that works for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds good. I've got another question for you from Flavio. Flavio asks, aside from quizzes, what other tools would you use for self-assessment, especially when grading happens automatically?
Yes, so besides quizzes, personally, I've recommended things like drag and drop activities. Those can also still be graded automatically. Hotspots. So those aren't always necessarily for self-assessment. They can also be used for teaching a topic, but they're still interactive. The student goes in and they select different pieces of an infographic or an image, and they learn more. I know this is still kind of similar to multiple choice questions, but another way of mixing it up a bit is thinking about videos with embedded questions. So having a student watch a video, partway through it stops and they're asked a question. So it's different than just text in a quiz. So those are a few examples of activities that are a bit different. You can also think of things like what we call in our department a sequencing activity. So maybe you're teaching students about a particular order that a process needs to happen in. And it's similar to a drag and drop in that they're then given examples of a process and asked to drag it in the correct order. So there are a bunch of different ways you can get at that understanding of content without it just being quiz questions.
Oh, very good. Another good question. We've got lots of good questions in here. This one is from Patricio Mori. Usually feedback is not very in-depth because it depends on an open question. Also, learners need to read other responses to learn from others. Do you have any advice to make discussion meaningful for learning and how to give feedback?
Yeah, so this goes back to outlining why something is important before a student does it. So if you explain the importance of thinking critically about other posts, about thinking about whether they agree or disagree with their peers' opinions and why, then you're setting the stage for them to, I guess, self-assess or think about what they're learning from the discussion for themselves. Beyond that, I would say, as the instructor giving feedback, I know sometimes it can be a lot, especially if you have a lot of students participating in a discussion. Something I've done in the past is I've had both a bank of canned feedback for things that come up a lot that I can pull from, and then throw in some personalized feedback so it's still targeting something that the learner needs to work on in particular. And that way you're speeding up the process a bit because you do have some of that canned feedback, but you're still personalizing it by saying at least one thing that's specific to that learner.
Indeed. Good. Thank you for that response, Darcy. A couple more questions here. Damon Ely asks, how do you encourage preparation and participation without having to use grades as a motivator?
Yes, this is a question we get quite a bit, actually. So some ways of encouraging that attendance or participation in these things is, again, I keep going back to setting expectations up front, but that's something that I think is really valuable in any course or learning experiences to tell the students what they're getting out of it. But another way of doing it is making things gamified to some extent. So you can think of ways to reward a student for participating that aren't tied to grades, so something like awards or badges, or something that we've discussed a few times is doing some sort of scavenger hunt, which is inherently rewarding for a lot of learners as well, where by participating in these things, they find some sort of Easter egg that then contributes to maybe an award in the end or something else they're doing in the course. I know instructors sometimes have included, a hidden video of an animal doing something funny, which is surprisingly motivating for students. If they find the Easter egg, they get to watch that. And I know it's still some sort of reward, but it's not necessarily a grade.
I've also wrestled with this idea of motivation. And one of the things that I tried in several of my classes is something, Darcy, that you mentioned earlier, was this idea of putting the students in charge of the discussion forum for a week, right? So they would be responsible for creating a prompt for the discussion forum, an open-ended prompt that they were expect students to respond to, and then be thoughtful, respond accordingly, and sort of lead the discussion. It's a very empathetic exercise because they quickly realize how much work is involved, and they're also wanting to do it well, right? No student wants to go out looking with egg on their face. So they really step up. I found when I had students then sort of take charge, that went a long way to get them motivated. For one example. I have another question from Darla Wise, and Darla asks, in these groups, there is always one student who submits things too late for the others to respond. Any suggestion for lessening this as an issue?
Yeah, so that's where some of those pieces we talked about earlier, like the group contract, come in. So something I've seen instructors do before is including within that if one group member submits something later than their peers, that maybe that affects their grade on the assignment. A better way of doing that potentially is that peer feedback, because not only then are you getting that insight from the group, but you're also allowing group members to engage in those evaluations to get experience doing that as well and reflect maybe on their own contribution. You can do a mix of peer and self-assessment. So that's one way at getting at that issue, is really having that peer feedback built in so you can have some insight into that as the instructor, and getting them to agree on a group contract at the outset as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that as well, Darcy. I'm glad you mentioned that. I have an interesting question here, and this is a very timely question. So to comply with social distancing, courses in the fall are going to be taught in a hybrid format at my institution. Half the class in person, half online, with a switch each week. So it's not solely online. So besides being sure to call on both students in classes and online, in other words, I need to be sure that I'm calling on both students in class and online. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage that?
That is a great question. So one thing I'm thinking of for that is you can still have all students engaged in some sort of online conversation. So using some sort of online tool to have maybe a synchronous session where the online students and the face-to-face ones are in that same discussion area or forum where they can all post in there, would be useful so that everyone is seeing what everyone else is saying. And that way you can pull questions or anything that's coming up from that online location. If you are doing that, you can also consider using polling to get student input throughout the class. So polling them maybe on, if it's review of content, what's the stickiest point or muddiest point that you can then talk about. That way everyone is getting to contribute their input if you are using something like an online discussion tool or online polling tool. And students in the classroom typically have their laptops as well, or their cell phones, so they should be able to connect to, even though they're in the classroom.
Thank you, Darcy. I've got enough time for 2 more questions, and I apologize if I was unable to get to your question. We will be receiving these questions afterwards, and Darcy and I will be following up with you if we were unable to get to it. So one of our last questions, how do you address issues of dishonesty?
That is another question that we get quite a bit. So if you're thinking about academic integrity concerns in the context of an online quiz or test, there are things you can do like setting a time limit, using question pools, changing the order of questions and the order of response options, or there's also online proctoring services that are available if that's what your concern is. But another way of doing this is thinking about going beyond just using quizzes and just getting learners to participate in some of these more problem-solving or project-based assessments. So they're actually, having to contribute, maybe for a portfolio, they're having to contribute a lot of different pieces of evidence of their learning, and you can assess that. So that's one way of getting around that. And if you are, doing a lot to really get learners actively engaged in their learning and motivated and make them want to show up, then hopefully that is encouraging them to be honest in the online course and actively participating.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That there's lots of ways to sort of address that. Group work is one way to think about that, but yeah, online there's always that chance. But a regular contact, I think, as you mentioned, Darcy, is also important to sort of, asking for that self-assessment, getting a sense of where students are struggling. And while we can't catch them all, we can do a pretty good job, I think, of keeping students honest with the types of assignments and activities that we're providing. And finally, I want to ask this question from Chris Neely, who asks, as I teach studio art online, I'm trying to replace a highly collaborative working environment, right? So students informally interact. Any ideas about how to get that Instagram collaborative feel with image sharing between students?
This is another great use case actually for something like a portfolio. So students can post their work in their portfolio, have their peers look at it, maybe give them feedback. Something we've talked about in a previous session is having some sort of gallery walk with the portfolio. You can also think about having more of an informal discussion area set up where they can reach out to their peers and talk through things they're considering with their projects, getting feedback. So really encouraging that, again, active participation and communication with their peers through some of the ways we mentioned earlier today, and really taking advantage of something like an online portfolio to showcase their work and reflect on it and share with their peers.
I like that. I like that idea, Darcy. Well, that's it for our presentation today on student engagement online, what works and why. And I'd like to thank Darcy for your time and talent here, Darcy. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Jason.
Okay, Darcy and Chris, thanks very much. Very informative presentation. Lots of great questions from the audience. And that does conclude today's webinar. Remember, everyone who registered and attended will receive a link to the slides and the recording today. And on behalf of University Business, the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in higher education, take care and have a great day. Goodbye, everybody.